What happens when a woman stripped of her dignity and publicly shamed refuses to break in the unforgiving heart of the Wild West? A mail-order bride named Clara Mae Thompson arrives in Redemption Creek with nothing but a faded photograph and a desperate hope. When she is brutally rejected before the entire town, she commits an act of shocking defiance. She embraces the one man everyone fears, the silent, wealthy, and tormented rancher, Silas Blackwood. That single, desperate hug ignited a firestorm of secrets, lies, and a hidden conspiracy that would unravel a dark tragedy and bring the entire hardened town to its knees, weeping in the dust. This is the story of how one rejected woman's courage exposed a terrible truth and taught a town the real meaning of redemption. The steam engine hissed its final mournful sigh, a plume of grey smoke dissolving into the vast, indifferent blue of the Montana sky. For Clara Mae Thompson, it was the sound of a life ending, and another she prayed beginning. She smoothed the front of her simple wool dress, the fabric worn thin from a journey that had drained more than just her meager savings. It had drained the very hope from her bones, leaving behind a brittle shell of determination. Her destination, Redemption Creek, was less a town and more a wound in the landscape, a collection of raw timber buildings huddled together against the relentless wind. Dust fine as powdered cinnamon coated everything, including the stern, unsmiling faces that turned to watch her descend from the carriage. She was an anomaly, a lone woman, stepping into a world of hard men and even harder realities. In her reticule, she clutched a photograph, its corners softened with handling. It was a picture of Mr. Bartholomew Finch, a man whose letters had been her only lifeline for 6 months. He had written of his prosperous general store, of his need for a wife to make his house a home. He had promised stability, respectability, things Clara had only ever dreamed of, while fleeing the suffocating poverty and scandal that had chased her from her home in St. Louis. A man stepped forward, his belly straining the buttons of a garish waistcoat. He was shorter than his letters had implied, his face florid, and his eyes small and assessing. He held a matching photograph of her taken 5 years prior. "Mr. Finch," she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Bartholomew Finch looked from the youthful, hopeful face in the photograph to the woman standing before him. He noted the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the faint silvery scar that traced a line from her temple to her cheekbone, a souvenir from a childhood fever. His lip curled in a sneer of profound disappointment. "You are not the woman in the picture," he declared, his voice loud enough for the onlookers on the platform to hear. The whispers started instantly, a cruel rustle of judgment. Clara's heart plummeted. "Time has passed, Mr. Finch, and the journey was arduous. But I am an honest woman and a hard worker. I will be a good wife to you." "A good wife?" He scoffed, crumpling the photograph in his fist. "I require a woman of pleasant appearance to stand beside me. A woman who will not frighten the customers." This, he gestured vaguely at her face, at her travel-worn state, "is an unfortunate deception. The arrangement is void. I suggest you purchase a ticket for the next train east." He turned his back on her, leaving her stranded on the platform. The world tilted. The whispers grew louder, morphing into snickers. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She was penniless alone, and now publicly shamed. Her vision blurred with unshed tears, the dusty street dissolving into a meaningless swirl of brown and grey. From the shadows of the livery stable, a tall figure watched the brutal exchange. Silas Blackwood did not come to town often. As the owner of the sprawling Blackwood Pines Ranch, the largest and most prosperous in the territory, he had no need for the petty society of Redemption Creek. He was a man carved from the wilderness itself, silent, imposing, and haunted. The townspeople gave him a wide berth, whispering about his immense wealth and the tragedy that had stolen his wife Abigail 2 years ago, leaving him a recluse. He saw the raw cruelty of Finch's dismissal, the way the man had puffed up his chest to perform for the crowd, and he saw the woman's shoulders slump, the fight draining out of her until she seemed to shrink into herself. In her devastation, he saw an echo of his own unending grief, a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache. Clara swayed on her feet, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She was going to fall. Her desperate gaze swept the crowd of leering, judgmental faces and landed on him. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't whispering. He was just watching his dark eyes holding not pity, but something else, a shared understanding of pain. Without thinking, driven by a primal need for a single anchor in a sea of contempt, she stumbled forward. She didn't know who he was. He was simply the only person not actively mocking her suffering. She closed the distance between them and with a choked sob collapsed against his chest, her hands clutching the rough fabric of his duster. It was not a plea or a proposition. It was the desperate act of a drowning soul clinging to the only solid thing in sight. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Silas Blackwood, a man who hadn't touched another soul in 2 years, stood rigid with shock. He could feel the woman's slight frame trembling against him. His first instinct was to push her away, to retreat back into the fortress of his solitude. But then he smelled the dust and lye soap on her hair, felt the frantic bird-like flutter of her heart against his ribs. He slowly, awkwardly raised his arms and placed them on her back, not pulling her closer, but simply steadying her, holding her up. The hug lasted only 10 seconds, but in the charged atmosphere of Redemption Creek, it was an eternity. Bartholomew Finch's face went purple with rage. The town gossips had a new, far more scandalous story to tell. The rejected mail-order bride had in a brazen display thrown herself into the arms of the richest and most reclusive man in the territory. The fuse had been lit. The whispers followed Clara May like a swarm of biting flies. After Silas Blackwood had gently disentangled himself and vanished back toward the livery, she was left to face the town's venom alone. Mrs. Gable, the sour-faced proprietor of the only boarding house, agreed to give her a room, but only after Clara surrendered her last valuable possession, a delicate silver locket from her mother. One night, Mrs. Gable had sniffed her eyes full of avarice and condemnation. "You'll be on the morning train, I trust. We don't have room for your kind of woman." Clara spent the night in a small, airless room, the jeers from the saloon below drifting up through the floorboards. They were talking about her the harlot and the grieving widower. Sleep was impossible. By dawn, she knew she couldn't leave. To go back east was to return to a life that was no life at all. Here, at least, there was a sliver of unknown, a chance, however slim, to fight. Meanwhile, at the Blackwood Pines Ranch, Silas was fighting a battle of his own. The feel of the strange woman trembling in his arms had unsettled him. It had been a long time since he'd felt anything but the dull, constant ache of Abigail's absence. The ranch, once a vibrant hub of life and laughter, had become a silent, sprawling tomb. His ranch hands, loyal men who had been with him for years, tiptoed around him, their conversations ceasing whenever he drew near. His foreman, a grizzled old cowboy named Samuel, found him staring out at the rolling hills from the porch of the main house. Trouble in town, boss? Samuel asked, his voice gentle. Finch is a fool. Silas grunted, not turning around. Aye, that he is. But it's not Finch they're talking about in the bunkhouse. It's you and the girl. Silas finally turned, his expression stormy. There is nothing to talk about. Tell that to Jedediah Kane. Samuel said, his tone darkening. He rode by an hour ago, a smirk on his face, wider than the Missouri River. Said it looked like you'd finally found a replacement for Abigail. His words, not mine. Jedediah Kane. The name was like poison on the air. Kane owned the neighboring ranch, the Circle K, and the animosity between him and Silas was as old as the town itself. Kane was a man driven by envy, constantly measuring his own success against the vast fortune of the Blackwoods. He saw Silas's grief not as a tragedy, but as a weakness to be exploited. The thought of Kane speaking Abigail's name, of connecting her sacred memory to the sordid gossip swirling around town, sent a spear of ice-cold rage through Silas. He had allowed his grief to isolate him, to make him vulnerable. The town and men like Kane saw him as a wounded animal, ripe for the picking. He made a decision. It was cold, calculated, and born of a sudden, fierce need to regain control. He saddled his horse and rode back to Redemption Creek, the morning sun casting his long shadow before him. He found Clara leaving the boarding house, a small bundle in her hands, her face pale but resolute. The townspeople stopped and stared as he dismounted before her. Miss Thompson, he said, his voice a low rumble. She looked up, startled. Sir, I apologize for my behavior yesterday. I was not myself. There is no need for apologies, he said, cutting her off. He glanced at the leering face of Bartholomew Finch, who was watching from the doorway of his store. He saw Mrs. Gable peering through a grimy window. I have a proposition for you. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. A proposition. I am in need of a wife. He stated the words, devoid of any warmth or romance. It was a statement of fact, like saying he was in need of a new wagon wheel. My home is large. It requires a woman's hand. You are in need of a home, and I presume protection from the vipers in this town. She stared at him, uncomprehending. You would marry me? A stranger? A woman who was just… I am aware of the circumstances, he said flatly. This would not be a marriage in the traditional sense. It would be an arrangement, a partnership. You would be the mistress of my household. In return, you would receive the protection of my name and a roof over your head. There would be no other expectations. The implication was clear, hanging in the air between them. A marriage in name only. It was madness, a desperate, insane proposition from a man she didn't know. Man whose eyes held more sorrow than the grave. But what was her alternative? The mocking cruelty of the train ride back to a life of destitution. The scorn of this town until she withered away. She looked from Silas's stoic face to the smirking visage of Finch, and the decision was made. She would not be broken. She would not be sent away in shame. I accept your proposition, Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing across the dusty street. A wave of shock rippled through the onlookers. Bartholomew Finch's jaw dropped. Silas simply nodded, as if settling a business deal. Come, he said, turning to his horse. We will see the preacher. As he helped her onto his horse, settling her in front of him, the town of Redemption Creek watched in stunned silence. The rejected bride was leaving not on a train of shame, but as the chosen wife of Silas Blackwood. The drama had escalated beyond their wildest imaginings and deep in the bitter heart of Jedediah Kane, a dangerous plan began to form. The Blackwood Pines Ranch was not a home, it was a kingdom. A grand two-story timber house stood proudly amidst a sea of rolling green pastures surrounded by towering pines that whispered in the wind. It was beautiful, but it was a cold beauty. As Clara crossed the threshold, she felt as if she was stepping into a museum. Everything was preserved exactly as it must have been on the day Abigail Blackwood died. A delicate lace shawl was draped over the back of a rocking chair. A book of poetry lay open on a small table, a pressed flower marking the page. And everywhere there were portraits, paintings and photographs of a beautiful smiling woman with eyes as bright as a summer sky. Abigail was not gone. She was an ever-present ghost, her silent judgment radiating from every surface. The first weeks were an exercise in excruciating awkwardness. Silas was a phantom in his own home. He rose before dawn and returned after dusk, eating his meals in silence at the head of a long, polished table. He and Clara were two ships passing in a vast, lonely sea, their only interactions consisting of polite, stilted necessities. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood." "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood." Clara tried to fulfill her end of the bargain. She directed the small staff, a cook and a housekeeper, with a quiet efficiency. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the massive complex machine that Silas commanded. But she felt like an actress playing a part for which she had not been given a script. Every time she moved a vase or suggested a different meal, she felt the unseen eyes of Abigail on her and the very real, sorrowful eyes of Silas. Her loneliness was a physical weight. She had a husband, a home, more material comfort than she had ever known, yet she was more isolated than ever. The town saw her as a cunning usurper. Her husband saw her as a necessary fixture. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the suffocating silence of the house, she wandered behind the main building. There, choked by weeds and neglect, she found the remnants of a rose garden. A few hardy, stubborn bushes were still producing pale, blush-pink blossoms, their sweet fragrance, a whisper of lost beauty. An old rusted trowel lay half-buried in the dirt. Something shifted in her. Here was a task, something that needed her. It was not Abigail's, not Silas's, but nature's. She pulled on a pair of work gloves she found in a shed and set to work. She spent hours, then days, under the hot Montana sun, pulling weeds, pruning the dead canes, and coaxing life back into the forgotten patch of earth. Silas noticed. He would watch her from his study window, a dark silhouette against the glass. He saw the way she worked with a fierce, focused tenderness. He recognized the roses. They had been Abigail's pride. After her death, he hadn't been able to bear looking at them, so he'd let them fall to ruin. Now, this stranger, his wife, was resurrecting them. He didn't know how to feel. It was a violation of his grief, yet it was also the first sign of life the property had seen in 2 years. The fragile truce at the ranch was not mirrored in the world outside. Jedediah Kane was not a man to let an opportunity pass. He saw Silas's marriage as a provocation. He began a campaign of subtle aggression. A section of fence separating the Blackwood Pines from the Circle K was mysteriously cut, allowing a dozen head of Silas's prime cattle to wander onto Kane's property, where they were promptly claimed as strays. A vital stream that flowed from Kane's land onto Silas's was partially dammed, reducing the water flow to a trickle. Kane also escalated his war of whispers. In the saloon, fueled by whiskey and resentment, he painted Clara as a conniving seductress who had trapped the grieving Silas. "A man ain't in his right mind when he's mourning." Kane would say to a rapt audience. A clever woman can see that. She saw a fortune and a famous name and latched on like a leech. Bartholomew Finch, still smarting from his own humiliation, eagerly corroborated the slander, embellishing the story with every telling. One evening, Silas returned late, his face like a thundercloud. He barely acknowledged Clara as he stormed into his study and slammed the door. Later, she heard the clink of a glass and a bottle. She hesitated outside the door for a long moment before knocking softly. "What is it?" His voice was a low growl. "The cook has kept your supper warm, Mr. Blackwood." The door swung open. He stood there, his tie loosened, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His eyes were full of a raw, untamed pain she had never seen up close. "Kane stole 12 of my cattle," he said, his voice rough, "and the whole town is laughing, saying I'm too bewitched by my new bride to notice." "That's not true," Clara said softly. "Isn't it?" He shot back, a bitter twist to his lips. "He's making a fool of me, and you are the excuse he's using." The accusation, though indirect, struck her like a slap. She felt the familiar sting of being blamed, of being seen as the source of a man's trouble. But instead of flinching, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She had been silent for too long. "Mr. Kane is a coward who attacks your fences because he's too afraid to face you," she said, her chin lifting. "And the men in the saloon are fools who would rather believe a lie than admit they misjudged a woman. What they think, what they say, it means nothing. This is your land. They are your cattle. Are you going to let a man like Jedediah Kane take what is yours because of idle gossip?" Silas stared at her, taken aback by her fire. He had expected tears or a timid apology. Instead, he saw strength. He saw the same resilience she'd shown in the rose garden. He looked past the scar, past the label of rejected bride, and saw the woman herself for the first time. He saw a fighter. He said nothing, but the fury in his eyes slowly banked, replaced by a flicker of something new, something he couldn't name. He closed the study door, and for the first time since Abigail's death, the house did not feel quite so empty. The uneasy peace, forged by Clara's defiance, was short-lived. Her words had stirred something in Silas. He became less of a ghost, his presence more solid. He began taking his meals with her again, and while the silence was still long, it was no longer heavy with unspoken grief, but with a cautious curiosity. He would ask about the progress of the rose garden. She would ask about the ranch. They were learning the language of each other, one careful word at a time. This subtle shift did not go unnoticed. Samuel the foreman saw the tension leave his boss's shoulders, and Jedediah Kane saw his primary weapon, Silas's isolation, disappearing. A cornered animal is a dangerous one, and Kane was beginning to feel cornered. His provocations needed to become threats. The discovery that changed everything happened by accident. Clara had been tasked with organizing a cluttered storage room, a space filled with dusty trunks and forgotten belongings. Inside a small leather-bound chest beneath a pile of Abigail's baby clothes, she found a diary. Her first instinct was to close it. It felt like a sacrilegious intrusion, but a nagging feeling, a sense of duty, almost compelled her to open it. This woman, Abigail, held the key to her husband's heart, and Clara felt she needed to understand the lock. The early entries were filled with love and laughter, painting a portrait of a joyful marriage and the excitement of building a life at Blackwood Pines. But as the entries drew closer to the date of her death, the tone shifted. A thread of anxiety and fear wove its way through the elegant script. October 12th, the Jedediah Cain was here again. Silas was in the north pasture. He says he is just being a neighbor, but there is a hunger in his eyes I do not like. He looks at our land, our home, the way a wolf looks at a lamb. October 19th, I saw Cain's men near Willow Creek this evening. They were rebranding one of our stray calves. I am certain of it. When I told Silas, he dismissed it. He said I was imagining things, that he and Cain have their disagreements, but Cain is not a common thief. I fear Silas's honorable nature makes him blind to the wickedness in others. Then came the final chilling entry, dated the day before she died. Her accident, the town believed was being thrown from a spooked horse. November 3rd, I followed him. I had to be sure. I rode to the old boundary line and saw it with my own eyes. Cain and 2 of his men, driving at least 20 of our cattle into the canyon. It is not just petty theft. It is a systematic operation. He is stealing from us from Silas. I confronted him. He laughed at me. He told me a woman's word means nothing, and that if I told Silas, he would ensure I regretted it. There was a look in his eye, a coldness. I am afraid. Not for myself, but for Silas. I must tell him everything tomorrow. He must see Cain for who he truly is. The diary slipped from Clara's numb fingers. Abigail hadn't been thrown from a spooked horse. It was no accident. A cold certainty washed over Clara. Jedediah Cain had silenced her. He had murdered the wife of the man she had married. Her blood ran cold. This secret was a living, breathing monster. To reveal it would be to rip open the barely healed wound of Silas's grief and pour salt in it. It would unleash a storm of vengeance that could destroy him. But to keep it secret would be to dishonor the memory of the woman who had penned these words, to allow her killer to walk free and continue to torment her husband. She carried the diary to Silas's study that night, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She found him reviewing ledgers, a deep line of concentration etched between his brows. "Silas," she said, her voice trembling. She never used his first name. He looked up surprised. "Clara, what is it? You're as white as a sheet." She placed the diary on the desk between them. "I found this. You must read it. The last entry." He picked it up, his expression clouding as he recognized his late wife's handwriting. He read the final page, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the small book. The ledger, the ranch, the world outside the study ceased to exist. There was only the spidery ink on the page and a 2-year-old grief turning into white-hot rage. When he looked up, his face was a mask of terrible, chilling fury. The sorrow was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. "He killed her." Silas whispered the words, tasting like ash. "All this time, I believed it was an accident. My Abigail." "He murdered her." He stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. He was heading for the gun rack on the wall. "Silas, no," Clara cried, moving to stand between him and the rifles. "You can't. Not like this. This is what he wants, to provoke you into doing something rash, something the law can't forgive." "The law," he snarled, his eyes blazing. "The law did nothing. He has been laughing at me for 2 years. He took her from me, and he has been stealing from me ever since." "Then we will use this," she pleaded, holding up the diary. "We take it to Sheriff Brody. We expose him for the thief he is. The rest will follow. We do this the right way, for Abigail." Her use of his wife's name, the sheer force of her reason, cut through his rage. He stopped, his chest heaving. He looked at Clara, standing before him, not as a business partner, but as a fierce protector of his life and his wife's memory. She was right. A blind, violent rage was not justice. It was surrender. But their time had run out. A frantic pounding on the front door echoed through the house, followed by Samuel's panicked voice. "Boss, fire! The west barn is on fire!" Silas and Clara rushed outside. The night sky was painted a sickening orange and red. Flames, hungry and wild, licked at the roof of the largest barn where the prize bulls and horses were kept. It wasn't an accident. It was an attack designed to cripple the heart of the ranch. Cain, feeling the net tightening, had made his most desperate, devastating move. In the terrifying glow of the inferno, Silas knew this was no longer about stolen cattle. It was a fight for survival. The inferno was a living entity. It breathed its fiery lungs, inhaling the dry timber of the west barn and exhaling a torrent of smoke and embers that painted the night sky in hellish shades of orange and red. The sound was a deafening symphony of destruction, the hungry roar of the flames, the sharp crackle of collapsing beams, and rising above it all, the high-pitched, terrified screams of the horses and bulls trapped within. The heat was a physical presence, a blistering wave that drove them back, scorching the very air they breathed. For a moment, everyone was paralyzed ants before a storm. Then the man, who had been a ghost in his own home for 2 years, was reborn in the crucible of the fire. Silas Blackwood, his face illuminated by the destructive glow, was no longer the brooding recluse. He was a commander. "Samuel," he roared, his voice cutting through the din, with an authority that hadn't been heard on this ranch in years. "Bucket brigade from the creek. Now wet down the roofs of the house and the other barns. Jed, get the pump wagon, Clara." His eyes found hers, and in them she saw not fear, but a terrifying resolve. "Get the medical kit from the house, set up by the well, and open the gates to the far pasture. Go." His orders galvanized the stunned ranch hands into action. Chaos became frantic, focused activity. Clara didn't hesitate. Her skirts flew behind her as she ran to the house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She burst through the door, grabbed the heavy medical satchel, and then, thinking fast, stripped several clean linens from a chest. Back outside, she established a makeshift aid station near the well, away from the worst of the heat, but close to the action. She raced to the far side of the main corral, her hands raw and clumsy with adrenaline, fumbling with the heavy wooden latch. As the gate swung open, creating an avenue of escape, she saw Silas tying a wet bandana over his face. He was heading for the wide, gaping maw of the barn, a black silhouette against the raging fire. "Silas, no!" she screamed. A raw cry of terror torn from her throat. It's too late, but he was already gone, disappearing into the blinding smoke. She watched her hands pressed to her mouth, her mind screaming. This was not the cold, distant man she had married under a business arrangement. This was a man willing to walk through hell itself to protect what was his, and a horrifying, gut-wrenching realization struck her. She could not bear to lose him. He emerged moments later, choking on the smoke, but dragging 2 terrified, whinnying horses behind him. Their eyes were wild with panic, but he spoke to them in a low, calming tone, his own fear completely suppressed. He handed their reins to a waiting ranch hand and, without a word, turned to plunge back into the burning structure. On his second trip, a section of the hayloft gave way, showering him with flaming debris. Clara screamed his name, certain he was lost, but he stumbled out, beating at the embers on his duster this time, leading his prize bull, a magnificent but panicked beast that could have trampled him in an instant, yet it followed him seemingly subdued by the sheer force of his will. Clara's terror gave way to a focused urgency. She was not just a spectator, she directed men to bring water for the rescued animals to keep them calm. She tore strips from the linens she'd brought, handing them out as makeshift masks against the choking smoke. She was a part of this fight, his partner in it. Silas went in a final time. The great central beam of the barn was groaning, the sound a deep guttural prelude to collapse. The heat was so intense, it was blistering the paint on the nearby fence posts. This time, he didn't come out alone. He emerged, half carrying, half dragging a young ranch hand, a boy named Billy, whose leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. The boy's face was white with shock and pain, a nasty gash bleeding freely on his forehead. "He went in after me, Mrs. Blackwood," Billy coughed, his voice raspy. "I was knocked down. He saved me." Just as they cleared the massive barn doors, the groan turned into a final, deafening crack. The entire roof structure collapsed inward with a sound like the end of the world, sending a mushroom cloud of sparks, embers, and black smoke billowing into the star-filled sky. The fight was over. The barn, the heart of the ranch's operations, was lost. Silas gently laid the injured boy on the ground, and Clara was instantly at his side. Her hands, surprisingly steady, went to work. She cleaned the gash on Billy's forehead with water from the well, her touch gentle but efficient. She assessed his leg, recognizing it was broken, and began preparing a splint. Silas stood, his chest heaving, as he drew in ragged breaths of the less tainted air. He looked at the ruin of his barn, a funeral pyre against the coming dawn. He looked at his men, their faces black with soot, their bodies slumped with exhaustion, but they were all alive. He looked at the animals, panicked but free in the far pasture, and then his gaze fell upon Clara. She was kneeling in the dirt, her dress ruined her face, smudged calmly, tending to his injured man, with a competence and grace that seemed impossible amidst such horror. She was a beacon of resolute calm in the horrifying aftermath. Their eyes met across the flickering firelight, a silent, profound communication passing between them. In that single, shared glance, the entire artifice of their arrangement, the cold proposition, the separate lives, the marriage in name only, was burned away with the barn. They were no longer a proprietor and a mistress of the house. They were partners, forged in fire and crisis. The reckoning came with the pale, sickly light of dawn. As Sheriff Brody and his posse rode in, their faces were grim, taking in the scale of the devastation. "Silas," the sheriff said, dismounting, "this is Black Knight's work. Any idea?" "It was Cain," Silas stated, his voice flat and hard as granite, all emotion burned out of it. "Silas, you know I can't act on that alone. Saying it and proving it are two different things." "I have proof," Clara said, standing up and stepping forward. Her presence commanded the sheriff's attention. From the pocket of her soot-stained dress, she produced Abigail's diary, holding it out. "Not for the fire, for something much, much worse." Sheriff Brody took the small book, his brow furrowed. As he read the final chilling entry, his expression shifted from weary duty to cold, hard fury. He looked from the diary to Silas, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. But before he could speak, one of his deputies rode up, dragging a miserable-looking man with him, one arm badly burned and wrapped in a dirty rag. "Found him hiding in the woods downwind, Sheriff," the deputy announced. "Smells of kerosene. Name's Hank. Works for Cain. He started talking as soon as I shined a light on this burn. Said Cain promised him $100 to light the fire, Create a distraction. Hank refused to meet anyone's eye, staring at the ground in shame. Said Kane was worried you were getting too close, Silas, worried about what your new wife might be stirring up. The confession was the final damning piece of the puzzle. The long-term rustling, the silencing of Abigail, the campaign of harassment, and the final desperate act of arson. It was all laid bare in the morning light. Sheriff Brody's face was like stone. He handed the diary back to Clara. "Ma'am, I'll need that as evidence. Silas," he turned to his posse, his voice ringing with cold authority. "Mount up. We're going to pay Mr. Jedediah Kane a visit, and he's not going to like our company." The ride into Redemption Creek was not a patrol. It was the advance of Avengers. They found Kane exactly where they expected to, in the saloon, holding court, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was already spinning a tale of the tragic accident at the Blackwood Ranch, his voice full of false sympathy. And right beside him, nodding eagerly, his face a picture of smug agreement, was Bartholomew Finch. Sheriff Brody didn't bother with the swinging doors. He kicked them open with such force they slammed against the inside walls, and the entire room fell silent. "Jedediah Kane," Brody's voice boomed, echoing in the sudden quiet. "You're under arrest for cattle-rustling, arson, and the murder of Abigail Blackwood." A collective gasp swept the room. Kane's face went from ruddy confidence to bone-white shock. "That's a lie," he sputtered, scrambling to his feet. "It's an insane accusation. Blackwood's gone mad with grief. He's trying to blame me for his own misfortune." "Is that so?" Brody said, advancing slowly into the room, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Because your man Hank, with his arm burned and his conscience guilty, says otherwise. He confessed to setting that fire on your orders." The sheriff's eyes bored into Kane. "And this," he said, nodding toward Clara, who stood with Silas just behind him. "This is Mrs. Abigail Blackwood's diary. She wrote down exactly what you did, Kane. The day before, you made sure she couldn't tell anyone." The color drained from Kane's face. He was trapped. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, for an ally, but finding only stunned, horrified faces. With a desperate snarl, he lunged for the gun at his hip. He was fast, but the deputies were faster. They swarmed him, a wave of righteous law, wrestling him to the ground before his pistol could even clear the leather. As they dragged the screaming, protesting murderer out into the dusty street, the townspeople looked on in utter silence. Their gaze shifted from the pathetic, struggling form of Kane to the shrinking, terrified figure of Bartholomew Finch. Then they looked to the doorway, where Silas Blackwood stood tall and unbroken, with Clara May, the rejected bride, standing proudly at his side. And in that moment, they saw it all. They had gossiped and judged. They had called her a harlot and him a fool. And all along, they had been blind, cheering for the villain and condemning the very people who deserved their compassion. The truth, in its terrible, stark reality, was more dramatic and more tragic than any rumor they could have ever invented. The whispers in the saloon died, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence of communal guilt. After Jedediah Kane was dragged away, spitting curses and threats that now sounded like the desperate pleas of a cornered rat, a profound and heavy silence descended upon the saloon. It was a silence louder than any gunshot, thick with the weight of communal guilt. The men who had been laughing at Kane's jokes just moments before now found themselves unable to meet each other's eyes. The half-empty glasses of whiskey on the tables seemed to mock them, remnants of a celebration of ignorance. All eyes, however, inevitably found their way to one man Bartholomew Finch. Finch stood, frozen, his portly frame seeming to deflate as the last of his bluster seeped out of him. The florid color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sweat-sheened grey. He had not just been a passive listener to Cain's slander, he had been its most enthusiastic amplifier, adding his own cruel embellishments, his own righteous indignation, all to soothe his pathetic wounded pride. He had stood beside a murderer, nodding and smiling. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at Silas Blackwood, standing tall and resolute in the doorway, and at Clara, her quiet strength, a stark condemnation of his own weakness. He saw not a rejected woman, but a figure of immense moral authority. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound of pure contempt. The very men who had been his audience now looked at him with disgust. Finch choked out a small, strangled sound and scrambled for the swinging doors, pushing his way out into the street. But there was no escape. The news was already spreading like a prairie fire, carried by the deputies and the stunned onlookers. The story of Abigail's diary, her courage, Hank's confession, the arson, the rustling, the murder, it all tumbled out, a cascade of horrifying truth. The town of Redemption Creek began to weep. It started with the women who had gathered outside, drawn by the commotion. They were the ones who had whispered the loudest about Clara, their tongues sharp with judgment. Now, hearing the truth of what Abigail had suffered and what Clara had endured, their faces crumpled. They wept for Abigail's stolen life. They wept for their own callousness, for the pleasure they had taken in another woman's perceived downfall. Mrs. Gable, the boarding house proprietor, heard the news as she was sweeping her porch. She sank onto the steps, her broom clattering to the ground. In her pocket, her fingers found the cool, smooth surface of the silver locket Clara had given her. She had taken it as payment, a trophy of her moral superiority. Now it burned against her skin, a brand of her own petty greed and cruelty. Her sour face, a permanent mask of disapproval, broke apart, and she sobbed, her shoulders shaking with a shame so profound it was a physical agony. Even the hardest men were moved. The blacksmith, a giant of a man, whose arms were roped with muscle, stood motionless by his forge, the hammer in his hand, forgotten. He thought of how he'd chuckled at Finch's description of the plain-faced bride. He thought of his own wife, his own daughters. He looked across the street at Silas and Clara, preparing to leave, and a tear he didn't even know was there traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. As Silas helped Clara onto his horse, the town formed a silent gauntlet. No one spoke. The air was too thick with regret. They were preparing to ride back to the ranch, to face the smoking ruin of their barn and the new, terrible reality of their lives. Just as they were about to move, Mrs. Gable stumbled forward. "Mrs. Blackwood," she cried, her voice hoarse and broken. She held out the silver locket in a trembling hand. You must take this back. I had no right. I was a fool." Clara looked down at the woman, her face a mess of tears and self-loathing. She saw not the shrew who had condemned her, but a broken soul begging for absolution. She looked at the locket, the last piece of her mother, of her old life, and she made a choice. "Keep it, Mrs. Gable," Clara said, her voice soft but clear, carrying in the charged silence. "Let it be a reminder, not of what you did, but of the kindness you are capable of in the future. Mrs. Gable stared, uncomprehending, then clutched the locket to her chest and wept anew, not with guilt now, but with the painful, shocking grace of unearned forgiveness. As they began to ride out of town, others stepped forward. A woman rushed from the bakery and pressed a warm, cloth-wrapped loaf of bread into Clara's hand. The blacksmith laid a newly forged set of hinges for a barn door at Silas's feet, a promise of help to come. An old rancher, a man known for his stony silence, simply took off his hat and held it over his heart as they passed. A young girl, braver than the rest, darted out and laid a single wild prairie rose on Clara's saddle horn. It was a clumsy, heartfelt, and utterly sincere apology from a town drowning in its own shame. The ride back to Blackwood Pines was long and quiet. They rode through the rolling hills, the vast sky above them, a canvas of bruised purple and pale pink. The shared trauma of the fire and the revelations had forged a new intimacy between them, one that didn't require words. They were no longer a grieving man and his convenient wife. They were two survivors bound by a shared ordeal. When they arrived, the sight of the smoldering barn was a fresh wound. The acrid smell of burnt timber and shattered dreams hung in the air. Samuel and the other ranch hands stood by, their faces grim, their shoulders slumped in exhaustion and defeat. Silas dismounted and walked towards the ruin, his boots crunching on charred wood. Clara was right beside him. He looked at the devastation, at the place where his prize bull had been kept, at the stalls that had housed his fastest horses. It was a crippling blow. One Cain had intended to break him. "We'll rebuild," Clara said, her voice firm, breaking the silence. "We'll build it stronger." Silas turned to look at her. In the fading light, her face was smudged with soot, her dress was torn, but her eyes held a fire that the barn's inferno couldn't touch. He reached out his hand, finding hers, their fingers lacing together naturally, instinctively. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond the loss of a building. "We will." That evening, the house was quieter than ever, but it was a different kind of quiet. The oppressive silence of grief had been replaced by a peaceful, contemplative stillness. After a simple meal they barely touched, Silas went into the main parlor. Clara followed and found him standing before the large central portrait of Abigail, her smiling face a beacon of a life long past. For a long moment he just looked at it. Then he spoke, his voice low and raspy. She loved this ranch. She saw its beauty when it was nothing but wild land and a dream. She was fierce, like you. He turned to Clara. The day she confronted Cain, she was terrified. I know she was, but she did it anyway, for us. He gently lifted the large portrait from its hook. "I'm going to put this in our bedroom, he said, his voice stronger now. "Her memory doesn't belong on display like an exhibit in a museum. It belongs with family, where it can be cherished, not just mourned." He then walked to the main wall, where the gallery of smaller portraits hung a shrine he had meticulously maintained. One by one, he carefully, reverently took them down. He handled each one with love before laying it on a table. "I thought that by keeping everything the same, I was honoring her," he confessed, his back still to Clara. "But I wasn't. I was trapping her, and I was trapping myself. Abigail will always be a part of this house, but she is not the whole of it anymore." He had cleared a space on the wall, leaving it bare and full of possibility. He was making room. He was clearing away the ghosts to make space for the living. He finally turned to face her, his eyes full of a raw vulnerability she had never seen. "The day you arrived, I thought you were just a desperate woman, collapsing against a stranger. She whispered, her own tears beginning to well. No, he said, closing the distance between them. He took her other hand, holding both of hers in his own. It was the first time they had truly touched since that shocking, desperate hug on the train platform. You were a survivor. You survived a life I can't imagine in St. Louis. You survived Finch's cruelty. You survived this town's judgment, and you survived that fire. Clara May. He said her full name, a testament to how fully and completely he finally saw her. You didn't just save my ranch tonight. You saved me from myself. Tears streamed freely down Clara's cheeks. Not the bitter hot tears of humiliation she had shed on her first day, but tears of overwhelming, unexpected, and profound joy. He saw her. For the first time, this man, her husband, truly saw her. Silas reached up, and with a tenderness that made her heart ache, he gently, reverently traced the line of the faint silvery scar on her cheek. Bartholomew Finch is a fool, he murmured, his voice thick with feeling. He was looking for some flawless doll. He doesn't understand that it's the imperfections, the scars that tell the most beautiful and courageous stories. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of polite arrangement, or even just one of gratitude. It was a kiss of deep, burgeoning love. A kiss that acknowledged all the pain they had both endured and promised a future where they would heal together. It was a promise of a new beginning, rising from the ashes of all that had been lost. Looking out over the moonlit pastures of the Blackwood Pines, they stood not as a man and his convenient wife, but as a husband and wife, finally ready to build a life, a home together. The whole village had been left in tears, but here on this ranch, under the vast, starry Montana sky, the final tears shed were ones of healing, of hope, and of the quiet, resilient, and beautiful promise of love. In the end, it wasn't a gunshot that brought justice to Redemption Creek, but the quiet courage of a woman who refused to be defined by her rejection. Clara and Silas's story reminds us that true strength is often found in the most silent hearts, and that even the deepest wounds can be healed by empathy and truth. It shows that a community is not just a collection of houses, but a shared responsibility, and that sometimes it takes tears to wash away prejudice and allow for real redemption. If this story of survival, love, and justice moved you, please give this video a like to show your support. Share it with someone who appreciates a powerful drama, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the heart of the Wild West. What part of Clara's journey inspired you the most? Let us know in the comments below.